Welcome to this Euractiv debate on protecting an evolving workforce, the case for agile protection, supported by Zurich. Before COVID came along, change was coming, and it was coming fast. But with the COVID crisis, digital transformation in all sectors is accelerating. Our reliance on software, data, and AI is intensifying. Digitalization has brought immense economic opportunities, but also labour force and social threats. In the EU, around 30% of workers think they could become jobless by automation by 2024. So social protection needs to be adapted and emerging risks managed efficiently. Today, we're going to talk about what needs to change. Is a new social contract needed in the agile workplace of the future? And you can send us your questions and on the Q&A panel, which you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen, and comment online using the hashtag EA Debates. So welcome to all of you this morning. I'm Brian Maguire. I'll be leading the discussion today. Let me introduce you to our panel. We have Dana Bachmann, Head of Unit for Modernization of Social Protection Systems at DG Employment, the European Commission. Victor Negrescu, MEP, Vice Chair of the Cult Committee, the European Parliament. Alison Martin, CEO, EMEA and Bank Distribution at Zurich, and Scott Marcus, Senior Fellow at Bruegel. Each of our panelists will have 2 minutes to present their opening remarks. Then we'll go to discussion with all the panel, and during this time you can send your questions on the Q&A panel. After the panel discussion, we'll bring the questions to our guests as well, and then they'll have a couple of moments for closing remarks at the end. So please send us your questions. We're looking forward to hearing from you. Dana Bachmann, you want to kick off this morning? 2 minutes and your introductory remarks. Very welcome. Maybe your microphone's on mute, Dana. Let's try again. Can we hear you now? Can't hear you. Let's just try and fix that. Victor, let's move on to you for a second if you are prepared there.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you. We can hear Victor clearly. Dana, the team will contact you now and we'll try and resolve the technical issue there. Victor, 2 minutes, your opening remarks, please.
Yeah, it's clear that the world is changing. Our jobs, our schools, our universities, our habits, and even our hobbies are changing. So therefore, of course, we need to adapt. Professions are disappearing. We have new professions that have just appeared. And this is due, of course, to the digital changes and the new technologies, but also this has been accelerated by the current pandemic. So, of course, we have to understand that the future is now. That means that we do not need to project ourselves in the future. We need to look at the reality that is in front of us, and we need to act with clear policies. We have the European social pillars. They give us clear guidelines in the direction that have to be pursued in order to make sure that we offer the social protection that workers need, but in the same time, we modernize our systems to make sure that everyone feels protected, and in the same time, everyone is supported in this adaptation process, in this modernization process. Because we have seen that the truck driver will not work in the same way in the future. Even the Uber driver, we thought this would be the future, had to change its activities. The teacher is not working the same way. Now we have digital education. The factory worker needs to adapt in the same time. He has to work with artificial intelligence. The journalist like yourself, you have to adapt to a digital environment. So we are in this process of change. But unfortunately, if we are not offering the right tools for this adaptation process, for this change, unfortunately, this will lead to job losses. This will lead, of course, to poverty. This will lead to a lot of people feeling alienated in a new society that has completely changed. So, of course, I'm calling for, and I'm just going to mention that, for the allocation of 10% of the recovery and resilience facility for education, training, upskilling, digital skilling. We need to have a clear support for this adaptation process. We need to have more than a strategy, because the Commission is coming with strategies. We need to have clear directions with the member states. We need to move forward because the reality is now, the future is now, and we have to come up with clear answers. Those answers have been brought in front of us by different experts. We have to look at those researches. We have to take that into consideration and implement clear policies, because if we do not do that, we see that in the figures. The direction is not good for anyone. So, of course, I'm really calling for fast measures at European level and for all of us to work together in this direction.
Victor, thanks so much. We'll come back and touch on some of those points that you mentioned in just a few minutes as well. We have Dana Bachmann's audio working now. Dana, can you hear us now?
Yes, just checking.
Good morning.
Does it work? Good morning.
We're here perfectly clearly. You have 2 minutes. Thank you, Dana.
Yes, so indeed, I welcome very much the debate today, and very happy to be among experts representing different views, although I think we are all converging to common idea of the need for very strong social protection system that actually cater for the needs of everyone, no matter the form of employment in which they are. And you both mentioned indeed the impact of the COVID-19 crisis, and we find that it has been a very, very powerful reminder to all of us of the importance of social safety nets. But it has also revealed lots of inequalities in the system, inequalities in accessing such safety nets. And we have seen, also triggered by the COVID-19 crisis, a series of acceleration of innovative approaches in extending social coverage, especially for those in non-standard forms of employment and self-employed. Nevertheless, these measures were all temporary measures, and I think the momentum that has been created by such measures needs to be maintained and put on a straightforward path for systemic reforms, supported indeed by the significant financial and fire engine that will be available through the Next Generation EU, but also the revamped MFF. When we talk about agile protection, maybe what I wanted to pass as a message from the Commission is that for us, social protection, of course, it needs to be agile to adapt to the realities of the labor market, of a society where we move towards climate neutral economies and society as a whole. But we need a social protection system that is adequate and effective for everyone and does not leave anyone behind. So I would really insist on the issue of adequacy and effectiveness of social protection. And a last point that I would also like to make indeed is that we believe that social protection is an investment, is not a cost, because it actually enhances the competitiveness and resilience of our economies and society. We also see that social protection, where it exists and gives people a feeling of confidence, a feeling of trust in the system, enabling them, therefore, to see things that normally they would see as challenges more as opportunities. And that's in particular the opportunities that are brought forward by digitalization, new forms of work, and new forms of employment relations. And the last point that I want to make, indeed, at European level, we have had the highest political commitment in a set of 20 principles, what we call the European Pillar of Social Rights. And it has been a big achievement to have this highest political endorsement a few years ago. But now, as we have seen with the COVID-19 crisis, we need to put much more efforts into translating these principles into concrete actions that actually do have an impact on people's livelihood. So we are working towards preparing an action plan for the Pillar of Social Rights. We are in an intense consultation with stakeholders, and therefore I very much welcome the debate today because it fits very much into these reflections. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dana. We'll come back again to those remarks also. Alison Martin from Zurich, floor is yours.
Thanks, Brian. So I think the challenges have been well laid out already by yourself, Victor, and Dana, and maybe to look a little bit to some solutions. So back in 2018, we entered into a 3-year research program with the University of Oxford Smith School to look at exactly the challenge of social protection. And on Tuesday, we published some research looking at pre and post-COVID world and how to bridge between them. Obviously, it's a bit too early to claim success on finding all the solutions, but a few thoughts for debate. So we found a very wide variation in attitudes to risk, particularly that of automation of jobs across Europe, from a low of 10% of workers in Germany through to more than 40%, for example, in Italy, fearing their jobs would be lost within the next 5 years. We correspondingly saw a relative kind of proportion of workers who were happy to participate in retraining opportunities, although perhaps we still see plenty of older workers need nudging into this. We found, though, that about half of the employers that we surveyed, they had over the past 3 to 5 years substituted technological skill for workers' skill. And about the same number, though, felt that it was their responsibility primarily to participate and support the retraining of workers necessary to adapt to the technological advances. We found younger workers are more likely now to be risk averse, both in terms of the types of roles, changing roles, self-employment, and also older workers are more likely to stay in the workforce for longer. These things will provide us with opportunities to look at more flexible workforce protection systems. And then lastly, the risk awareness of the need for protection has obviously risen substantially, and perhaps the right designed compulsory and voluntary schemes can support risk redistribution. So whether that's between high and low paid workers, whether that's between generations. We think it's really important to contribute as business to this debate on social protection. We ourselves are going through a big digital transformation journey, and we've made work sustainability one of our top priorities, making a series of commitments to our employees about promoting internally, supporting insourcing rather than outsourcing, supporting our workers to look at where the next best role would be that is more future-proofed and is less at risk of automation. So I think that together, I think we have a great representation across the universe of different perspectives on the panel. I think it's together that we're likely to find the solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. It's great. And let's welcome also Scott Marcus from Bruegel. Scott, good morning.
Good morning, Brian, and thank you. So it seems to me that the EU is facing multiple challenges today, but as we've already heard, some of these really are just an acceleration of challenges that we were already well aware of. I'm going to focus on 4 main aspects today. One of them is the impact of digitalization, and together with that, globalization. Secondly, a shift from traditional employment to self-employment. Third, the impacts of the pandemic. And fourth, challenges to the funding of the European social model. So as far as digitalization, automation, robots, are the robots coming to take our jobs? Well, yes and no. There was a paper in 2015 that caused quite a stir when it predicted that 47% of the US workforce would be at risk of unemployment within just a couple of decades. But hardly anybody today believes the quantitative results of that study, even though it's a good study. Today, we recognize that when you look in more detail at the jobs and when you consider the different effects, jobs are being created, new jobs created, about as fast as old ones are destroyed. What's abundantly clear is that every job is changing and that we're seeing an accelerated pace of change. This has implications for social protection. It also has huge implications for education, training, retraining, and implies a need for a shift to lifelong learning. Now, another change that we're seeing is the move to the gig economy. But again, this is largely an acceleration of a tendency toward more self-employment, more flexible work arrangements. What's increasingly recognized and very visible in the European institutions' pillar of social rights is a focus on ensuring social protection, not just for traditional workers, but also for the self-employed. The recognition is that the self-employed, especially those who don't have their own employees, they also need health insurance, they also need pensions, they also need protection against accidents on the job. Third, I'd like to say a few words about the pandemic. Even the darkest cloud can have a silver lining. World War II was an enormous tragedy, but it also accelerated the take-up of aviation. It also accelerated mass production of penicillin. What we're seeing in this crisis is a huge increase in unemployment. A good survey by Euro found in April, at the peak of the lockdown, 23% claimed that they had temporarily lost work. An additional 5% said they had permanently lost work. We saw an even larger number who reported reduction in numbers of hours worked. This is why measures like short-term solutions like German Kurzarbeitergeld have been really important, have generated results better than in the United States. But at the same time, we've seen 37% reporting that they're now working from home as a result of the crisis, where they hadn't been before. So again, an acceleration of an important and a positive trend. Clearly, some jobs are more suitable for remote work than others. We'll come back to that. As far as challenges to the funding model, we can come back to that too. So with that, back to you, Brian.
Scott, thank you. Thank you to all our panelists for excellent opening remarks. Scott, I'm just going to pick up on some things you said and pitch this back to the rest of the panel as well in terms of the speed of change. And Christine Lagarde said a couple of months ago, just as you outlined there, that change had been coming anyway, but COVID is making it come much faster. And also this survey that you mentioned, this report about how quickly jobs will be lost, to 40% plus of people losing jobs as a consequence of automation and AI. Andrew Yang, who ran for a presidential candidate for the Democrats as well, he's written a book, I'm sure you've read, The War on Normal People. And he has this expression about how we have this false sense of security. So you talk about jobs are being replaced, and for those with new jobs, those that have been lost have been replaced and new jobs created. But Yang argues that basically we're sleepwalking into a huge disaster because we think this is going to continue, but there's a point at which, like the Industrial Revolution, that the change will come so quickly that we simply can't replace jobs as quickly as they're lost. Do you subscribe to that? Do you think that we're sleepwalking into a bigger disaster? We need to move more quickly as well to replace these structures? Scott?
I would say the balance of opinion today doesn't support what Yang is claiming. And with that in mind, universal basic income, which he's putting forward, is a solution to a problem that we probably don't have. If you look at results in Europe, again, some of my colleagues at Bruegel have done some of the econometrics. What they find is, again, that if anything, there's a slight increase in employment likely. There's some increase in polarization of wages. So high-skilled are doing better and low-skilled may be doing worse. But the feared loss of jobs, which, by the way, tends to be expected, if anywhere, mostly for middle-skilled jobs, not for top or low-skilled jobs. That doesn't seem to be happening so rapidly. If you look at Europe, the areas that have the highest intensity of robots show an increase in jobs, not a decrease. So I'm less worried about this than some people are.
Victor Negrescu, you mentioned earlier about Uber drivers, for example. This was the new paradigm was going to be the self-employment and the flexibility for different types of jobs typified by the Uber driver. And you're kind enough to point out that journalists are facing some change as well. So what do you see in terms of what Scott has just said as well? Do you think that this is there's a false confidence here as well? Scott has one set of data. Do you see another set of data which reflects a different pace of change? And Scott also pointed out about the difference between salary scales as well. Those is there social structure going to change as a consequence of this? Lower paid workers will continue to earn less. Middle grade workers will do okay for the moment at least. How do you see it?
I think actually all those changes have brought, of course, a lot of issues on the table. We call for more flexibility, but we didn't define this flexibility. So we have people that are not protected anymore today. So we have, I mentioned the Uber driver. We have different types like this, jobs like this, of people that are self-employed. And we saw during this pandemic that those people were left alone, and we didn't have any mechanisms to protect them, or at least we didn't have, let's say, common mechanisms at European level to know how to deal with this situation. And again, I'm coming back to the European social pillars. We wanted to refer at some point in that document to the 0-hour contracts that, of course, are raising a lot of issues and a lot of problems for workers across Europe. And this will lead, of course, to poverty and probably to a lot of issues that we will have, of course, to be confronted with. And this will mean, more money and more investment. So it's a vicious circle if we do not tackle it. It's in the beginning. In the same time, we noticed during the current pandemic, people working remotely from home. And we also look at statistics and we see that those people that are working from home actually are working more hours actually to do their jobs. and this guides us to new issues that has to be raised also at European level. They have been raised in some member states. For instance, the right to disconnect and to the idea of work-life balance. You are at home working
to
the same
Dana
time.
Blackman as well. Dana, the social pillar is not there just to guarantee jobs. It's about a quality of life for European citizens as well, trying to achieve something that reflects a work-life balance as well, which Victor's alluded to as well. We're working longer hours at home. You're trying to balance work and family, and there may not be the same social structure of support because of the COVID crisis as well. We're nowhere near talking seriously about a universal basic income in Europe at the moment. But how do you see the progression in terms of support for the more flexible workforce in the action plan? How is that developing?
Yes, I think that already, I will go back to the Council recommendation, because the Council recommendation adopted in 2009 and actually put forward by the Commission already in 2018 was precisely designed in order to address the coverage gaps, in particular for people in non-standard forms of employment and self-employed. So I think it's work which has been started as an acknowledgement of the increasing trends on the labor market to move to this kind of non-standard forms of employment, which of course include the platform workers, the gig economy, and so forth. And now, as we are progressing with implementing this recommendation, of course, the responsibility lies with the member states, but we work together with them, for example, in devising, agreeing on a monitoring framework that can give a sense of mapping what is actually happening on the ground. And it's see indeed in many cases a lot of difficulty in even getting the data and having a very clear understanding of what we mean by different type of employment contracts, what
Let me
kind
put this
of
to Alison Martin. Alison, the Oxford studies which Zurich has supported, they look a lot at the different opinions and different attitudes across Europe. And you mentioned earlier about risk perception as well. But let's talk first and just stay on the subject of speed of change as well. Do you see a change of attitude in terms of the pattern of studies that you've seen over the last few years? Are people more sensitized to the need to upskill, reskill, or are they still in the same mode that they were a few years ago in terms of the risk awareness?
We see it very much depends on the generation. So
Okay.
we looked at different generations, and without wishing to stereotype, and apologies for that, but the research shows that those under 40 have a different approach to not only the risk that they face, they perceive a higher risk of their roles being automated, but they're also much more willing to actually give up their own free time to support retraining and reskilling so that they have relevance in the future. I mean, it does vary by country, but we definitely see a distinct difference between the generations. And that has not changed.
It hasn't changed. Okay. And in terms of planning, how is there a different expectation of what is needed to plan for a successful career, and in terms of social support, social structure as well? Is this changing from what you can see?
So the awareness, or rather the perception of risk, so the concerns that employees have, we researched nearly 20,000 employees around the world, their perception of what they were most concerned about. So income in retirement still rates number one as their biggest concern, but then it does vary by country, looking at whether it's paying bills, whether it's being able to pay for additional medical support. Those things vary, but predominantly the biggest concern still remains for workers, their ability to have a sufficient income in retirement. Now, the notion of how close that risk is to them has clearly accelerated through this crisis, yes. And I think we clearly do see that for people, their proximity to risk. So I guess in the behavioral science availability bias of what you see right here and now is the thing that you become most concerned about. Yes, people are aware, and I think that makes it very much the time now to build and to make sure we put in place, whether it's additional compulsory schemes, support requiring employers and governments through tax incentivization to work with employees to ensure that they do have protection, whether that's income protection, whether it's protection against critical illness, whether it's protection against life kind of events, etc.
Okay, thank you. Victor, how can we talk about social protection for workers when youth unemployment in Spain is still at 47%, for example, and across the European Union, the figures aren't that rosy? Are we evaluating a generation which simply has not really found its way into the workplace and doesn't really see a lot of potential for change in the near future?
I think you are raising a key issue, Brian. Who pays for it? How do we construct or reconstruct our social security system and our system as a whole? Who pays for the lifelong learning? And therefore, of course, we are lucky enough to be in the European Union and do that together. We need to find new ways. We speak about own resources at European level. We speak about a redistribution system, and this has to be redefined. We were looking, for lower taxes in the past. We were looking for different solutions that meant, different ways of stimulating our economy. But we have to change all of that. I think Europe can be in the front row of these changes. I know there are tests being done across Europe. Spain has come up with the basic income. This might be a solution, but I think we can do, and we should do more about that. And I'm calling upon member states and the Commission to do more on that. We seem to wait, for solutions to come from somewhere else. And this is frightening also for people that are waiting for solutions that nothing is coming, while in the same time being confronted with this situation. So I really believe change is needed, and we should be really, really courageous in coming up with proper solutions in reforming our systems to deal with this issue.
Okay, but you say we should come up with these ideas and that somebody else is always looking for ideas. Well, what are your recommendations for what really needs to change now?
I think, for instance, we have the recovery plan. It's a great idea, and the Social Democrats have supported it. Everyone is supporting it, but we have to see how the money is being spent. I don't want just to put numbers there. The numbers are there, but we have to do more on that.
10% of the recovery resilience plan as well for upskilling and reskilling as well. Is that enough?
I think it's one solution. It's a more solution. The next MFF, we are discussing about the multi-annual financial framework. But we are giving money to member states without any clear direction. The European semester format is not really correlated with the money. And we know the problems. They are mentioned there in that document. But no one is following that. No one is following the money. And I think we should do that in a more clear way, because if we do not organize ourselves better, the money is being spent and there is no real recovery and no real change, structural change.
Let me ask Scott. Scott, where would you put your money in terms of building more resilience into the future economy?
Specifically for social protection, the point I'd like to make is that the decisions that we have in most of the member states really go back to the days of Otto von Bismarck in the 19th century. This notion of workers basically paying for their social insurance made a lot of sense then. And it still makes sense in many contexts, but there are alternative approaches that are much more universal. If we look, for example, at the UK National Health Service, it's a completely different model. It's healthcare for everybody. It has its own problems, and it has its own risks, and it has its own high costs. But essentially, the model that we have for funding in the long term is going to be more and more difficult to sustain, particularly because of the changing demographics, increasing number of elderly people that have to be supported by a decreasing fraction of younger people is a challenge for all of these systems. Also, we've got a general shift, and this is part of the digitalization problem. More and more of the gross value added of society comes from capital and not from labor. So having all the burden fall to the workers is going to become less sustainable over time. Something that's based probably on general revenues is likely to be the right solution in the long term. But every member state has its own systems, and this is a point that Donna was already making. This European Pillar of Social Rights, the Associated Council recommendation, they're great principles, but the member states have to put them in place, and these systems are extraordinarily different from one another. So it's going to represent a huge challenge, and it's going to take time.
Do you think this will lead to greater inequalities across Europe as there's a failure to integrate different systems and social mobility, labor mobility becomes more difficult as a consequence of this? Scott?
I see it as a risk, but I think the moves that we're already seeing at European level try to address it. The various responses to the pandemic also, I think, try to address it. It's going to be a challenge, but I think the challenge can be met. What I noted before, the shift to automation has some tendency to cause a greater polarization of incomes, a greater tendency for the rich or highly educated to get richer and the less well-educated to get poorer, and those in the middle also to have problems. So we've got to watch out for this.
Okay. Let me put this to Alison also. Alison, it's not just the rich and poor, it's male-female in this as well, isn't it? There's a gender pay gap which accelerates in terms of pension provisions, which can be up to 40% by the end of a woman's career as well. Are we any closer to redressing what is such a huge misfit in a modern economy? I think France, there was a study this week, said that it would take France 1,000 years if it continues at its current rate to redress the pension pay gap.
So unfortunately, it doesn't look like there's a huge amount of progress. I think France may be a little bit of an outlier, but I think most countries it's in the hundreds of years, which we certainly shouldn't be proud of. I think unfortunately, and it's a reality that COVID-19 has landed more heavily in terms of that income differential on women and on younger workers, and it's those populations that also are at more risk of role automation. So I think I do agree with Scott's comments around the fact that in the long run, actually automation is likely to be a net positive. However, the period through which we need to actually provide protection is right now. And unfortunately, we don't seem to have the right structures in place right now. One point, I think we in the investor community, one thing, Brian, I just wanted to really say, I mean, what could we do? Because I think we need to talk about what can we do. I think we do need to encourage that the investor community, and Dana obviously mentioned climate change earlier, actually. I mean, there's been a huge focus in the investor community around ensuring transparency on critical issues like climate change. What are people actually doing? I think we need to have a similar level of focus on what are companies doing to step up to their responsibilities societally. So why do we not have the same push for transparency of disclosures around what organizations are doing to look at not only their gender pay gap, which is clearly important, we disclose as, but also actually what are you doing about reskilling your workers? What are you doing? What are the social contract that you actually have in place with your employees? I think again to Scott's point on the where is the capital currently being raised? We know obviously that the tech firms tend to have proportionately a lot less workers than many of the industries. And so just being very clear about, okay, what's the responsibilities and obligations on business, and ensuring that investors have transparency, can make choices around what kind of society and future they want to invest in.
Thank you. Let's pick up on the transparency issue there as well. Dana Bachmann, Iceland was, I think, one of the first in EEA to really structure transparency for equal pay, defining the kind of job in an organization and matching that against the male-female pay structure as well. We don't have this across Europe yet. I think some member states are advancing towards this, but most aren't. Is this something which needs to be done to address the agile workforce?
Yes, so maybe also just to highlight that we are working on an initiative on pay transparency, precisely tackling the gender dimension, which is supposed to be adopted before the end of the year as a follow-up to the earlier equality strategy adopted by the Commission. So that's something that definitely we are very keen to focus on and to address as part of the equality strategy. Nevertheless, if you would allow me, I would like to come back to the RRF because I think Victor also raised some important issues in that respect. So I wanted indeed to highlight that when the COVID-19 crisis started, the Commission had to balance between trying to give maximum flexibility to the member states in order to allow them to react quickly and to address the social and economic impact and the health impact of the crisis in a timely manner. At the same time, to prepare the long-term, let's say, recovery package very quickly. And I would also like to say that in putting forward the proposal for the recovery package, the Commission also gave very clear pointers in terms of where investments should go. At the end of the day, indeed, it is the member states that will have to prepare their national plans, but there are clear guidance in all the documents surrounding the RRF that point to areas of priorities, of course, dealing with climate, digitalization, but always having the social resilience and the fairness concept in the back as a, let's say, thread throughout all these investments. Also, I think it's very clearly, the point is very clearly made that the reforms need to tackle with the issues identified in the country-specific recommendations, both last year and this year. And we are actually quite happy to see that there is a very strong focus on upskilling, reskilling, an issue that you have put forward, but also on active labor market policies, inclusion policies. So there are lots of incentives for member states to actually develop and draft their national plans, taking into account all these challenges and to mobilize investments for the right cause.
Thank you, Dana. Victor, Scott raised some issues about the structure between capital and labour as well. The rich getting richer. Mr. Bezos is enjoying this crisis perhaps more than others. How do you see the taxation structure changing? Europe is not going to have European Union is not going to have a broad taxation capability anywhere in the near future. But the taxation of capital versus labour, are we going to see shifts in this dimension as well? Because the social structure is going to become seriously imbalanced as a consequence if that trend continues. What do you think?
Yeah, I think we have to act on taxation. We have to start with tax havens. And we recently saw the council deciding that a tax haven will not be considered a tax haven anymore. They made some weird decision in this direction. Secondly, we have to make sure that everyone pays taxes in Europe and no one has special conditions offered by a member state, which unfortunately has happened for some companies in some member states, like the Commission has brought that in front of us. Thirdly, we have to make sure that the companies that are winning out of this situation, this change, are also paying fair taxes everywhere in Europe, and that we have a proper tax collection across member states, because we have countries that are incapable of collecting taxes, and this is generating a problem. So we have to really consider taxes as being a positive and constructive solution. So tax education at the same time could be something that we should highly promote at European level, and there are some initiatives in the field that I have myself initiated. So again, if we reconsider our position regarding taxes and we see in taxes a solution to get money for more investment and for those changes, I think we can do that in a proper way. And just to refer to something that our colleague from the Commission has said, I think she's right, but we have to make sure that we put things in place. So for instance, I look at the document of the Commission, and they refer to education in those documents regarding the recovery plan only 4 times to refer to previous documents. So this is interesting. If we want to reform things and change things, we have to make sure that we really underline what we stand for in the document that are being released by the European institutions.
Okay, thank you. Just we're going to go back to Scott and follow up on taxation in just a second. But Q&A, we have some questions coming in. Please keep sending your questions. I'm going to come to some of those in just a moment. You can please use the Q&A box. And if you go to the chat, we can still take it, but please use the Q&A box. It's a little easier for us to track there as well. Scott, Robert Reich, who was Labour Secretary under Bill Clinton as well, he wrote and produced Inequality for All as well. Who's going to pay for stuff if people lose their jobs? The rich will continue to get richer to a point, but the capitalist system, as we say it today, will cease to function if poor people, and middle class particularly, get poorer. How is this imbalance going to correct? And as a consequence, if the likes of Jeff Bezos and large organizations continue to avoid tax to the degree which is currently happening, who's going to pay for the social structure which is needed to ensure democracy continues as well? How do you align these elements?
There's a lot there. Well, I was born in the United States, but I don't take a very American view to this at all. I think that society has a responsibility to try to make sure that those who have the worst social position, particularly through no fault of their own, that they're elevated to some extent, that we try to smooth out a bit the inequalities that the capitalist system might otherwise make. That's why I like the European system. That's why I choose to live on this side of the Atlantic. But there's a lot that needs to happen. We have inequality that in many respects is growing from COVID, from automation. There's a number of papers suggesting that women academics are having more trouble publishing during the pandemic. But also on the positive side, a study from Eurofound suggests that women may be more suitable for remote work than men. So perhaps there'll actually be some relief coming from that end as well. In a lot of areas, there's just a huge number of individual problems. We talked earlier about lifelong learning. What we see in the statistics is most of lifelong learning goes to those who are already highly skilled, because that's where the companies are motivated to give it. So we need to be working on this. The points that Victor made before about taxation are really important. We need to sort out our corporate taxation system. It's hard to do that solely within Europe. The Commission has put forward some initiatives. They're not getting much traction. Ultimately, I think the right notion will be for the OECD BEPS process to finally get the necessary traction. As many of you will know, the US under Trump pulled out of the system. But the basic notion that tax should be paid where the profits and revenues are earned is the right one, and we need to get there, and we somehow need to get a global consensus that that's the way that things need to work.
What are the chances of that?
At the moment, not so good, but at least we can have a serious discussion under a different US president, which I hope is coming.
Yeah, best of luck with that. Victor, just to follow on with that, just assuming that there is no consensus, global consensus, and that well-paid tax lawyers find a way through the system, continue to find a way through the system, and these taxes do not find their way into public coffers anytime soon. What's the plan B?
I'm supportive of the plan A, to be very frank, and I think we have to really be supportive of that. At the same time, I just mentioned tax collection. We are struggling with this issue at European level. So we are not collecting the taxes that we are supposed to collect in a lot of member states, and this is a problem. In the same time, we need to cooperate better in having, let's say, a common approach towards taxes. We have tax competition in Europe, which sometimes leads again to unfair competitions and to the fact that some corporations, the big corporations, are using that in their own interest and dividing us upon that. So if we cooperate more, we can do certainly that. I'm in the tax committee subcommittee that was recently created in the European Parliament, and we are trying to come up with solutions in this field. So it's clearly is not an easy game, and no one or big companies don't want to pay more taxes. So it's like a fight between the small players and the big players.
I don't want to pay more tax. I pay 52% tax here in Belgium. I'm pretty sure that a whole bunch of companies that I'm buying services from are not paying anywhere near that.
We have countries, but at the same time, in Luxembourg there were companies that were supposed to pay 60% and they never paid the 60%, or they went to Ireland where the VAT was quite low and they have different advantages, or they go to Eastern Europe in the same time. So across Europe there are different advantages given to different companies. So we have to deal with them in a more transparent way. I think this is a solution, and of course to tell people what we are doing with their taxes. This is also absolutely important. But
so
like I said,
tax transparency in terms of expenditure as well.
Yes, this is what I said. It's clear that we need transparency, because otherwise people will not trust the system. If they give their money to the state and the state is not transparent about the money, this is a big issue. This is why we need to deal with all of that in the same time.
Thank you. Let's go to one of our questions from Jessica Carreno-Lor. And which are those systemic changes that need to occur to expand social protection to all forms of employment? Which are those systemic changes that need to occur to expand social protection to all forms of employment? Dana?
Yes, I think these are very clearly stated in the Council recommendations. There are various dimensions that we want to address. First of all is extending formal coverage to all types of workers, which in a way it's also a form of ensuring equality of treatment, all types of workers and the self-employed, of course. It's also ensuring, in addition to the formal coverage, an effective coverage. So making sure that the conditions for accessing the benefits that come with such social protection mechanisms are reasonable and are applied in such a way that people do get effective access to such benefits. It's also about ensuring the adequacy of such benefits, allowing dignified standards of living. We talk a lot indeed also about transparency of benefits and helping people understand what will be the return from the system if they contribute to the system, but also having what I would call kind of wider awareness campaigns, so that everyone within a society is quite clear where do these social contributions go and how they are redistributed across the system.
Okay.
Yes, I would stop here.
Thank you. You can come back in just a moment. Alison, just on the same question, what needs to occur to expand social protection on all forms of employment?
I think first and foremost, we need to be clear societally about who do we think should be paying for this. So do we believe that this burden sits on the state, it sits on companies, it sits on individuals? Do we believe that it needs to be distributed equally amongst us, or should those who benefit most from taking advantage of having gig workers or kind of people who, by their very nature, typically cost employers less money, should they also make sure they're contributing in some compulsory fashion to ensuring that they have sufficient income in the times between roles? I mean, our view is clearly it should be a little bit of everything, and it shouldn't fall necessarily entirely on the state. Obviously, a significantly debt burden through COVID-19 and before. It should also fall, and I'll go back to the transparency point. I think companies should be very clear about how they are contributing to ensure a fairer society.
In terms of how we see a fairer society, is our perception in Europe shifting in this regard as well? You know, previously, our measure of economic success was essentially GDP. You know, are the numbers going up on GDP? And now that notion is increasingly being challenged, and we're looking at a more a different view, a broader view in terms of how we live, how we enjoy life, the longevity of our life, the quality of our health during the course of our lifetime. These things as well. So, you know, are we becoming more French? Are we working to live rather than living to work?
So, Brian, if that's addressed to me, I mean, I'd say we're talking exactly about externalities, and we could have the same conversation about whether we're talking about climate change, whether we're talking about ethical use of data and digitalization. I think as a society, we're becoming more aware of the fact that there are externalities that we have historically not necessarily reflected in the way that we've measured success, and whether that's company success, where we've looked at returns on capital, and that capital could have been used in many different ways, and it could have had quite negative consequences for people, for the environment, etc. So I think there is obviously a significant movement now towards more stakeholder capitalism as opposed to shareholder capitalism, and I think we can only encourage that, because I think the broader set of factors that get considered and are transparently reported on, and therein lies a different issue, that we need to be clear about having a consistent framework for reporting, so it's a fair level playing field. But I think that is the way forward, where we do believe in a broader set.
Thank you. Scott, same question, Jessica's question. You know, what needs to change and to expand social protection for all forms of employment?
Well, first, actually, taking up on the last thing that you asked, if I might. So I think when we look at GDP, I think there's an increasing perception. It's not only a question about how much wealth is produced, but also how it's distributed to the population. And so the distributional effects really matter. In terms of getting social protection to the full population, I would once again support what we've been hearing from Donna and the work that the Commission has been doing here, and also from Victor. Basically, the principles are clear. Social protection needs to be for everybody, not just for those who are in traditional employment. and the Council recommendation makes exactly the right points. Getting it implemented in the member states is going to be a challenge. And actually, one other thing I think that that we haven't touched on, but it's worth spending a moment on, is the question of transferability of benefits. Historically, we had legislation in the EU to provide traditional workers to carry their pensions over from one member state to another. We didn't have similar protections for non-traditional workers or for the self-employed, and we didn't have protections within the member state either among those categories. That's a principle that's put forward in the Council recommendation. It's going to be a little tricky to implement, but it's important. Consider that an Uber driver very likely is spending part of his time as an Uber driver and may very well be spending part of his time as a part-time worker or as a taxi driver. It's common. So we need more flexible systems that recognize the more complex world of work that we're moving to.
Thank you, Scott. Victor, let's take another question from Celia Pereiro. Celia asks, do you think the decrease of the globalization mobility of the workforce, including jobs that could be provided from home, will stay after the pandemic, and for how long, also within the EU?
Firstly, I think we have an accelerated globalization despite the pandemic. Now we can work remotely for a job that you have anywhere almost in the world. So I think the trend generated by the pandemic probably will continue to a certain extent. I mean, here remote working, for instance, might continue. The need for new technologies, digital education will become something quite common. And in the same time, companies are going to get used to that. So probably they are going to rent less offices and so forth. So these are trends that are going to last, I think, for the upcoming years. So this is why I said at the beginning of my intervention, we have to look at the reality. The future is now, actually. So we have to come up with solutions right now and deal with those issues. We have to have more consultations at European level. We need a common European answer on a lot of those issues, because we believe that we can deal with them isolated, all by ourselves, closing our borders, closing our communities. This will not resolve the issues that we are confronted with. So my call again is to, let's say, open up and discuss more. I think the Commission and also maybe the European Parliament can play an important role in bringing stakeholders together.
Okay, thank you. Scott wanted to comment on this, and then I want to bring Dan in as well. Scott.
Well, yes, I wanted to make the point, first off, that what we're already seeing is things have changed in ways that are not likely to go entirely back to where they were. The way that we're having this conference, we wouldn't have done a year ago, at least not in quite the same way. The amount of bandwidth used by conferencing services like Zoom, like WebEx, went up 25 times, not percent, factor 20, just in the period from February to April of this year. Now, there's been a very good study done by Eurofound in the spring that looked at what fraction of jobs lent themselves to remote work. And they found huge differences. Certain kinds of finance jobs were very suitable for remote work. Other kinds of jobs were much less suitable. My hairstylist can't do remote work. But it also needs to be understood as part of a complex system where there are a lot of kinds of work that historically were done at sites other than the employer's site. Construction is typically done at a different site. Transportation, many of the jobs are not at the employer's own site. They're done in a bus or in a train. Fisheries, agriculture. But I think what we're seeing is a world where a move where more can be done away from the office becomes possible. And as Victor was saying, it has broad societal implications. Some of us don't need to live as close to big cities as we historically did because we don't have to spend as much time at the office. So there'll be a wide range of changes.
Thank you. Victor, if there's any chance you can get training for home hairstyling, I will sign up for that, given my previous experience with lockdown. I think that'll be a popular European policy. Dan, I wanted to bring back in the COVID-proof capacity of the social pillar action plan. The Copenhagen seems a terribly long time ago. Is the action plan going to be COVID-proof?
Yes, I think that's precisely everything that the Commission does nowadays. It needs to be COVID-proof. And I can give you the example. We were working on the skills agenda that was supposed to be adopted, I think it was mid-March. And at that point, we decided indeed to take a bit of longer time in order to precisely reflect within the skills agenda the lessons that we learned from the COVID as they were in the actual making, especially on the not only for the formal education, lots of lessons for pupils and teachers, but also for the adults who out of a sudden had indeed to engage into the remote working without necessarily having the digital skills or the mindset to engage with these new ways of communication. So indeed, everything that we do nowadays, it's COVID proof, and meaning that we want to put a strong focus on resilience and solidarity. And I think that goes back a bit to the discussion just before, that the COVID crisis did not put into question the big policy priority of the current Commission in terms of digital and green transitions. It has just accelerated them and gave even a renewed impetus for addressing much more in depth the social dimension of the crisis. And again, I would say, looking at the nature of jobs, what we have seen in the middle of the COVID, that precisely those jobs that are low paid, that are, let's say, the most fragile workers, were the ones that kept the society functioning. And in many countries, it led to a debate on valorizing those jobs and leading to increased pay, especially for the aides-soignants, as we see here in Belgium. So there has been a certain trigger to reflect on how we value the jobs and how we reward them in terms of all the package that comes with such recognition.
Yeah, but isn't there a huge dose of hypocrisy with that as well? You will stand on our balconies and clap and applaud the health service workers, but ask me to pay more tax and I'm going to put my hands in my pockets and keep them there. That's largely the attitude. And governments will have a really tough time raising tax afterwards as well. I just want to touch on what you said about your individual resilience as well. Alison, individual resilience, the communitarian approach to that we finally got to with the COVID crisis as well would imply that we're all in this together, and the state should kind of take care in the future as well. But individual resilience has a big part to play in this too. What do you see that needs to change in terms of how we as individuals, whether we're salaried workers or independents, how we need to adapt for the new work future?
I think awareness is probably the number one thing, and then you could debate about how you can get that awareness. So obviously we would.
What do you mean by awareness? Awareness of what?
Awareness of the risk. Sorry. So are workers realistically aware of the risk? I mean, I think we touched on this a little bit already during this discussion about, is it a real or is it a perceived threat of automation, and is your role actually likely to be automated? So I think there is an obligation and a responsibility both on worker and importantly on employer to be able to provide that transparency and understand what is the glide path. There are some brilliant tools out there. We use a few that actually look at skills of typical roles that are most at risk of automation and how you can move workers through from those roles to ones which are much more future-proofed. Now, I think the onus is to have very grown-up conversations between employers and employees around what risk is there and what are the opportunities, and then how can you do that retraining. So who is the obligation on the retraining of? And some of the research we were looking at is that there is clearly a discrepancy in the industry typically with employers as to who they believe should be funding that retraining. Obviously, historically, that was very much relied on. That's a government responsibility. I think going forward, we see that's a lot more the responsibility of the employers themselves to support making workers as fit for the future as we can.
Just in terms of individual personal responsibility and capacity to work, COVID taught us some things about who we are as functioning human beings as well. If you're substantially overweight, your risk of COVID multiplied significantly, but people don't appreciate that. 30% overweight has a massive increase in your cancer risk as well, which, should you get sick in any way like this in the future, how you deal with your job and your employment in the future is also at risk. Is there a broader conversation to be had in workplaces about self-care, and we could touch on mental health and other elements as well, where the employer becomes a conduit of good behavior which reduces the burden, not just for the employer over the medium and long term, but also for society. Alison.
Yeah, 100% agree. I think there's a really important role that employers can play in all kinds of well-being for their workforce, whether it's emotional, whether it's financial, whether it's mental, whether it's physical, about providing transparency and access to information and access to choices. So there's a lot of opportunity for employers to participate in different insurance plans, for instance, whether it be for pension, for life, critical illness, for income protection, and whether it's health insurance, and to enable workers to contribute and to understand, importantly, the actions that they can take, and whether it is about planning for retirement, whether it is about actually your own personal well-being. If you look at the technology that exists today, I am a wearable device wearer. And I think the insights that you can get nowadays on your own personal well-being, and then linking that into actually access to personalized products and services to help improve your well-being. I think we are in a very different society today than we were even 5-10 years ago. Now, clearly, we could then also talk about the importance of data privacy and actually what you use that data for. So I'm not suggesting that all sources of data.
And also, just to stay on this, I want to bring the same point to Dana as well. Our instinct is to go to government and say, fix this, and then try to get 27 member states to agree around the same scheme, and then dilute everything down to the lowest common denominator and try to live with it at the end. But is it not within our capacity to see substantial societal change by focusing more on large employers and the trickle-down effect that could have in terms of behavioral adjustment, lifestyle changes, and flexible for a creation of an agile workforce? Do we really need government to do this, or can we do this to a large degree through private enterprise? Alison first, then Dana. Thank you, Danny. Just to keep on the same point, but to emphasize that the circular economy, if we look at what Coca-Cola and other large industries have done in terms of circular economy, when they decide in their procurement chain that something will change, every organization, every one of their suppliers has to comply with that as well. And so you end up with recycling policies which are implemented quickly and effectively and profitably as well. You know, do you think that the Commission should worry less about the member states?
Well, I think the point I wanted to make, sorry, I didn't hear Alison's intervention, but the point I wanted to make about your previous question was that when we talk about social protection, upskilling, reskilling, about not only member states, of course, are the ones that have the competencies according to the treaties, but there are areas where we also have a very deep dialogue with social partners, both on trade unions and employer side. And I think this is, I come from the skills sector. I used to work for 7 years before on vocational education training, skills policies. And what was very reward bringing together member states, employers, and trade unions, sometimes also vet providers, to precisely agree on the way forward, looking at a mix of governmental and, of course, interventions that take place through private actors and at the workplace. And I think a key message is that it's neither one or the other leading. They need to work together and have, of course, a very clear common goal that they pursue.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions here. I want to put these to Victor and to Scott. Victor, Bjorn from Finland asks, any possibility to make, for example, an EU-level framework agreement that could ensure good work conditions in this context?
Yeah, I think we have to have a common framework. And again, I'm coming back to the European social pillars. They are offering a common framework, but like it was said at the beginning of our discussions, it seems that some member states do not really want to implement all of that. And we have a lot of, again, initiatives or documents that have been approved in the past by the European institutions, and we have been delaying in implementing them. So really, we need to do more on that, and I think it's time for a common answer when dealing with this situation and these issues that are important for everyone. It seems every citizen in Europe feels the need for a strong European answer. And you said at some point, and I'm finishing on that, we are calling for the state. Yeah, it's strange, when we are doing good, no one wants the state to intervene. We said more flexibility, more freedoms. Now, when we need help, we want the state to be present. So let's try to find the balanced solutions and have a proper answer also at European level.
And what do you say about to Alison's example of nudging as well? That the UK and its approach to pensions, it was able to nudge the public in a particular way. Do we need to look more carefully at how we change behaviour within the European Union as well? That we don't stay allied to Otto von Bismarck, as Scott said earlier. Is it time to upgrade our labour systems?
Yeah, I think we have to upgrade our social system as a whole. And of course, we have to have an open conversation, transparent conversation with citizens about that, about taxes, about changing social system, about not having 0-hour contracts, about working better between with trade unions and employers associations. We need a new social contract at European level. But we have to present it.
Otto von Bismarck had some particular advantages at the time. Who's going to provide the clear leadership to get this done, or is this going to be such an organic, messy process that we won't really notice it get done, but that things will evolve gradually? Victor?
I think the system has changed, but I would love to see the Commission doing that. But I didn't see von der Leyen saying anything about that in her speech in front of the European Parliament, the State of the Union speech. So I think it's a wake-up call. Our debate today is a wake-up call, hopefully, for the Commission to do more on that.
What did you see with von der Leyen's speech that encouraged you about the flexible labour market of the future?
I didn't see anything, actually. This is what I was saying. She was not doing anything about that, just doing daily jobs, daily activities. So we really need a perspective on the future on that, and the Commission has to come up with this perspective. We have new initiatives like the SURE program, for instance, that was launched by the Commission, which is a great program, a great initiative to deal with the current situation. So we can really do things at European level if we really want it.
Okay, Scott, do you share Victor's pessimism about von der Leyen's plan for the future?
Well, I didn't read it as carefully as I should have. I certainly did. The bit about minimum wage certainly caught my attention. That seemed to me to be promising and appropriate. But yes, I think when the question is how do we all come together, there's no substitute for leadership. And at the moment, I think we have a need for leadership, but it's hard to push this issue when we're in the middle of a pandemic-inspired health and economic crisis at the same time. But it's what's needed.
Do you think Macron is somewhere close to aligning those priorities? Scott?
He's all over the place. I'm not sure. I think it hurts in the right place.
Okay. Just a quick question to Dana, then I want to come back for closing remarks as well. Dana, Jessica Carrero asks, where is the Commission in its process of reviewing its framework on health and safety at work? And will new labour realities be in it? Let me throw in mental health there as well in terms of the health and safety. Where's the Commission on this?
Yes, that's precisely what I wanted to touch, because I wanted indeed to highlight that we have a number of work which is in place or it's ongoing, related to working conditions. On one hand, the transparency of working conditions, but also health and safety and work, with new actions that are being rolled out, in particular in terms of the cancer risk related, that would also feed into DigiSante work on a new action plan for beating cancer. Then I also wanted maybe to respond to Victor that actually there is is a lot that is being done at European level in order to address the opportunities of digitalization and the transformations on the labor market, and through the different angles and implications. And I would talk about the skills agenda and the various flagship it initiated, of course, with the Digital Education Action Plan and European Education Area, more on the education side. The Youth Employment Package, which came out also very early in the process, precisely to draw attention of the member state to early intervention measures to avoid another youth employment crisis as in the past. And then, of course, with the pillar of with the action plan for the pillar, we are collecting a number of ideas from various stakeholders. We are pushing forward with the minimum wage, as some of you have mentioned. I think in President von der Leyen's speech, she also mentioned with regards to SURE that we will need to look into the potential, because that is for the moment a temporary instrument, potential for turning it into a permanent stabilization instrument.
Okay, thank you. We're going to just go to the quick closing remarks as well. Let's start with Scott. Your takeaway from today's discussion, what needs to change in terms of our new social contract for the agile workforce?
Well, first, thanks so much for putting this wonderful panel together. I liked a lot of what I heard today. I think what we heard is that there's a lot of work to be done, but also a lot of good work has been done. And at this point, we have to turn good ideas into reality.
Thank you. That was concise. Victor? Can't hear you. Can't hear you. So I'll come back in just a second. Dana, same question.
Yeah,
what needs? Okay, we got Victor back. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think we need leadership because again we have things that have been done, like everyone has said here, but they are not visible enough. In a time of crisis, again, we need to build confidence. I still remember, the New Deal in the US and the fireside chats and everything like that. This is important again for people to trust a reform process, a modernization process, to feel confident in themselves, in making the change, in adapting and so forth. They need to be inspired. And this is what is lacking, unfortunately, not only at European level, but also at global level, to deal with the current changes generated, like it was been said, by the pandemic, by innovation, by the way we are working today. And of course, we have to come up with proper solutions. So we need to rethink how we do things, the security system, the tax system. And like you have said, and I'm going to finish on that, Brian, we need to upgrade yourselves as much as possible, and upgrade our system with confidence, by involving all stakeholders. And I think our discussion today, let's say, it's an example that we can really discuss among ourselves, even though we have probably different points of view.
Thank you. We'll invite Ursula von der Leyen for a fireside chat over coffee or over a whiskey in the near future, I think.
Indeed, that we need to build on the lessons we learned from the crisis, on the accelerated innovation that took place, triggered by the crisis, and turn this kind of temporary measures into permanent systemic measures. I also take that we need to connect better policies, because regional, local levels, and most important, take into account realities on the workplace, leading by the example. So we very much look forward working together and building on the excellent examples of innovation taking place already now.
Thank you, Dana. Last word to Alice Martin.
Thanks, Brian. So I think having these exchanges is really important. And I think, as Dana actually, said at the very beginning, that there's probably more of a convergence of views on this topic than perhaps we would have imagined. I think it is really important that it's not just on this panel, but obviously that it's a broader societal convergence of opinion. I think, Brian, you pointed out some hypocrisy that may exist still. For me, one critical thing I think we need to do, there's been a huge focus on the E in ESG. And as we think about investors and we think about transparency and where capital flows, I think we need to put as much attention in the S and making sure that actually sustainability principles around workforce are getting focused attention and transparency, like employee resilience programs, for instance, as we are spending on the E.
Thank you, Alison. And thank you to all our audience who joined us online today. You can continue to comment using the hashtag EA Debates, and our social media team will respond to that for you as well. Let me thank Dana Bachman, Victor Negrescu, Alison Martin, and Scott Marcus for their excellent contributions today. I enjoyed the conversation today. Thanks to Zurich for supporting this conference online today, and also to our team for Simona, Malta, and Marlene for organizing everything and ensuring that we're actually able to talk to each other today also. So stay tuned for more debates coming up in the next few days. I'm Brian McGuire. Wish you a good day.